The other day, I got a text message out of the blue. It said, "How would you rate the performance of Jesus?" I clicked on it. It said, 3 quick questions will improve your service. How would you rate the performance of Jesus who assisted you recently? It was from Tellus. And then the other shoe dropped. I thought, aha, I had a tech support guy named Jesus. He was from Latin America, and he did a fine job, and he solved my problem. And so they had said, rate him on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being excellent, 5 being poor. And I said 5. I said 1. And this is how it read as I punched it in. Jesus has been very, very good to me. Tell us. I'm sorry, we cannot understand your response. Please just use the numeral 1 through 5. There's a definition of theology that says theology is how we talk about God when he's not in the room. Now, we Unitarians have a slightly different angle on this. We're happy to rate Jesus for quality control purposes, don't you know? But Jesus, not so much. We tend not to talk about Jesus or God or any deity by name because not everyone here believes in one. In fact, I would say it's a minority position. But nobody here will tell you you can't believe in a deity, just as nobody will tell you you can't believe there's no deity. And everything in between is fair game too. That's one of the best things about this faith. It's a big container. It is the big gulp of spiritual beverages. Have you seen the new sign out front? Different beliefs, shared values? That is Unitarian Universalism. And that's kind of where we're going with this service today as we explore just how to build a life of meaning without dogma, leaving room for doubt. How would you rate the performance of this faith on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being excellent and 5 being poor. I give it a 1.5 because nothing is perfect except maybe. It is so good to be with you today. Let's start things off by singing number 16 in your program. This is an old Shaker song, and I think it's going to get us into the perfect mind frame for what's coming. Good morning, North Shore. Good morning and welcome. Welcome to our home on native land, the traditional ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. My name is Bruce Grierson, and I'm so happy to be scrubbing in with you today as your service associate. Somebody's reminded me to make an announcement about turning off your cell phones. We kind of fell out of the habit, and last week I had quite a few of them go off. If you're new to this arrangement, there are 5 of us who share this role of steering the services. It's part of an experiment we call distributed ministry. The idea is this is a pluralistic faith, and so it makes sense to have many voices in the pulpit. Many voices, many perspectives, many takes on what an hour of you-ing up ought to look like and sound like. So, new or old, we are so glad you found your way to us this morning. Now, each week, we begin things here by lighting a flame, a tradition dating back more than 400 years. Our flame is a candle that sits in a chalice, and that chalice has been a symbol of Unitarianism for at least 80 years. See, we are not just making this stuff while we're waiting for the pasta to boil. This is a faith that has deep roots. And I've asked Lila to help with this morning. How goes it? How's your frame of mind?
Today is a very good day. There have been some bad days, but today is a good one.
Okay, we'll go with that. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be in this moment of your good day. We kindle this flame as a symbol of our gathering.
May the light of understanding illuminate our darkness. May the warmth of sharing bring us peace.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you to stay up here and do the other 2 candles with me. The first one is the candle of joys and concerns. And this is joys and sorrows that are in our own community. So there's a few things to mention. Happy Robbie Burns Day. Thank you, Yasha, for thinking of that. Chinese New Year. A very clean parking lot with no leaves in it, thanks to our factotum, Brian McConnell. Thank you so much. We have a birthday to think about. Malcolm, tomorrow. You have a big one. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else have something to chime in that they're happy about? All right, well, one sadness. Allison, our thoughts are with you this week. It's a very, very difficult week for you. We are with you. Now, the candle of global concerns. So a few tiny glimmers of hope this week. Fragile ceasefire in Gaza. California wildfires coming under control a little bit. But overshadowing everything is the gathering storm coming from down south. I don't know how many of you caught this, but on last Sunday, the Bishop of Washington, the Right Reverend Marianne Edgar Buddy, led a church service in Washington at which President Trump was present. He was sitting there with an increasingly deep scowl spreading across his face as she spoke. And what she did, Reverend Buddy did in that service, was I think she called him out and she called him in. She said, contempt is a dangerous way to lead a country. That's the calling him out part. The calling in was she urged the president to show mercy toward LGBTQ plus people and migrant communities. And so if you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to share a few of her words, and Lila has kindly agreed to help me with this. So Reverend Buddy spoke of unity, and pay attention to the phrasing here because I think some of this is going to sound quite familiar to us. What are the foundations of unity, she asked. Let me suggest that there are at least 3. The first foundation for unity is honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every human being.
That means refusing to mock, discount, or demonize those with whom we differ, choosing instead to seek common ground.
A second foundation of unity is honesty in both private conversation and public discourse. If we aren't willing to be honest, there's no use in praying for unity because our actions work against the prayers themselves.
A third foundation for unity is humility, because we're all human. We make mistakes. We do and say things we regret. We have our blind spots and our biases. And we are most dangerous to ourselves and others when we are convinced beyond a doubt that we are absolutely right and that someone else is absolutely wrong. Because then we run the risk of labeling ourselves the good guys versus the bad guys.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn astutely observed that, quote, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. We are more like one another than we realize, and we need each other." Let's take 2 minutes of silence right now. Let your mind go where it wants to go. All right. Well, as you know, because I've talked about it here more than once, I've been studying this emerging discipline called intellectual humility with a group of other journalists and academics. We've met a couple of times down in Berkeley to try to push this field forward. And now, intellectual humility is a hard thing to talk about. It's like that old saying, the louder he spoke of his honor, the closer I watched my spoons. The more you gas on about your intellectual humility, the more people suspect that you don't actually have any. So now when people ask me what intellectual humility is, instead of trying to define it, I tell this story. Okay, this is Wade LeBlanc, baseball pitcher for a number of major league teams. He was pretty good until, quite suddenly, in the middle of his career, he lost his stuff. After one particularly bad outing in which he was shelled for, I think, like 10 runs, coach calls him in and says, "Wade, we're sending you down to the farm, AAA affiliate team in Tucson." So the next morning, Wade is getting into the taxi to the airport to dutifully report to the minors. It might be the low point in his life. The cab driver looks at Wade in his rearview mirror, sitting there dejectedly. The cabbie says, "Watched the game last night." Wade's going, "Oh, geez, here we go." And the cabbie says, "You've got some good stuff, but I think there are some things you could try. Maybe like going over your head in the wind-up." Now, you could be forgiven if you're a professional baseball player and at this point you put your earbuds in and you tune out. But Wade didn't do that. He sat there and he listened to the cab driver's armchair analysis of his pitching mechanics. So he reports to Tucson the next day, and Wade tells his pitching coach that there's something he'd like to try. What if he brings his hands up over his head in the delivery? He tries it in that night's game. Astonishingly, it works. He finds he has more control. In the next start, he deploys the technique again and pitches lights out, a one-hitter. Wade LeBlanc bounced right back up to the majors, and he incorporated the cab driver's tip into his technique for the rest of his career. That, I tell people, is intellectual humility in a nutshell. Don't assume you know what the heck you're doing, and don't be too proud to be open to other people's opinions. There's no one you can't learn from. Okay, so that's pretty cool, and that's as fine as far as it goes. But back in Berkeley, as our project wound up, and we all shared our results, and we all kind of all but tattooed into our chests, "I could be wrong, and you could be right," which is pretty much the motto of intellectual humility. I thought, you know what? There's more here. We're not at the end of this. It feels, in fact, like we're actually at the beginning of something much bigger. What we've been talking about, this openness to change at the level of our thoughts and opinions, that's great. That's awesome. Goodness knows the world needs more of that when we're staring into such deep divisions. But it occurred to me that if we're really serious about cultivating humility, it's time we started thinking about it at the level of our most profound existential beliefs and fears and hopes and convictions. I think what happened in Berkeley was we all got issued training wheels. We're preparing for a more serious endeavor. The exploration, care, and feeding of a higher level of humility I'm calling spiritual humility. So what does that mean? Well, one place to start talking about it is the way religion talks about it. All the major faith traditions value humility. It's in the sacred texts, it's in the rituals, in the mythology. And yet there's a bit of a worm in the apple here. This kind of humility has a specific meaning. It's about submission before God. You're literally lowering yourself to the ground. That's the root of the word humility. It comes from the Latin humus, earth. And that's not exactly a mind-expanding stance. In fact, as a psychologist named Joshua Hook put it to me, it's a little bit the opposite. Instead of exploring all channels of input, he said, you're shutting down all channels of input but one. So this is the certainty trap, as it's sometimes called. You're so certain that you don't even realize you're wearing blinkers. You're failing to acknowledge that there's a chance you bet on the wrong horse here, or at least that you don't fully understand the nature of the horse race. And let's face it, in spiritual matters, none of us do. It seems presumptuous to suggest that your faith alone has the goods. And this is what's putting a lot of people off of organized religion, at least here in the West, I would say. But it strikes me as just as arrogant to fall into the certainty trap in the other direction, to say, no friggin' way, man. None of the claims of your religion stand up to science or the historical record. Your PR department is way out over its skis here. I call BS on all of it. Your God does not exist. The fact is, somebody else's faith, or any faith, if you're an atheist, can look absolutely bananas. You're going, what right-thinking person would even give this a second thought? But dismissing something because it doesn't make sense to you, that's a problem too. In philosophy, there's a principle known as Chesterton's fence. So imagine you see a fence out in the middle of nowhere for no apparent reason. Doesn't seem to be keeping anything in or out. Would you feel okay about tearing it down? So a philosopher would say, and the guy who this is named after did say, that that's actually the worst reason to get rid of something, because you see no use in it. That just means you're blind to its real use, its intended use. Chesterton's fence says, don't rip down things that are meaningful to someone else just because they make no sense to you. At least not before you go, that's strange. I don't understand. Maybe I should investigate further. Years ago, 20 years ago now, wow, I did a long feature for Psychology Today magazine called An Atheist in the Pulpit. It was about clergy who, in the middle of their careers, lost their faith. And you can imagine this put them in a very awkward position. They suddenly felt like frauds, standing up there in front of their congregation, preaching a story they no longer believed in. But at the same time, for them, there was a trust bond with their parishioners. If they were to get up there and say, sorry, folks, it's all a pack of lies, that would be very distressing to them. So how they dealt with the cognitive dissonance there was fascinating. Now, as I say, for context, this was around 20 years ago, right at the time the new atheists were stalking the earth. And the four of them, the four horsemen, Sue talked a bit about them last week, they were very persuasive. And their influence was rippling everywhere, even into the most sacred spaces. And the priests and the ministers I spoke to for this story, they were no match for it, a lot of them. So I was almost done the research for that story when I stumbled on one more story. And this one instantly felt like the beating heart of the whole thing to me. It was different from the others because it wasn't a full-on U-turn. This gentleman I found, maybe he found me, didn't end up where Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists say you're supposed to when the scales fall from your eyes. He arrived somewhere more shaded, and to my mind, a little bit more interesting. There he is, Bishop Carlton Pearson. He was a fiery Pentecostal pastor from Oklahoma, son of a fundamentalist preacher, and he too had the shine, and he had the flock. More than 5,000 people routinely came out to hear him preach at his megachurch in Tulsa. And once a month, 20,000 showed up for a big tent revival he did in the area. He was a fundamentalist rock star. And then something happened. Bishop Pearson experienced what he described to me as a series of apprehensions. The first one came while he was watching a news report about the genocide in Rwanda. Women and children slaughtered and starved. And he's thinking, where's God here? And now his mind is working on the hairline crack that just opened up. And he finds himself wondering about heaven and hell. And he's thinking, you know what? Having a bit of trouble here believing God would consign people to hell just because they haven't accepted Jesus Christ as their personal savior. So Gandhi's in hell? Babies? So now Carlton's conflicted. He's going, something's got to give here. And he decides hell does not exist except as earthly misery created by human beings. So on Sunday, Bishop Carlton Pearson gets up in the pulpit and he says, basically, folks, I'm calling an audible. Everything's up for review. I now believe there are no bouncers at the gates of heaven checking ID. Salvation is for everyone. Quote, I say God loves all mankind and that everyone is already saved. Well, you can imagine how this goes over. People were furious. The Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops called him a heretic. They issued a statement, and this is the statement: any Christians who continue to follow Carlton Pearson put at risk the eternal destiny of their souls. That'll put a damper on your membership drive. Most of his congregation deserted him. The bank would soon foreclose on his church. I had a long phone conversation with Carlton not long after all this went down, and he said, Bruce, I don't always say this publicly, but I'm starting to feel more free to do so. I don't believe in a God or the God. I just believe in God, some essential, eternal, ultimate reality that's infinite, undefinable, and maybe in some sense unknowable. You can experience this God the way you experience wind and rain and light. It's the same God that Muslims and Hindus and Jews pray to, the only God there is, I think. I wrote in that piece, like James Brown, whom he strikingly resembles, Carlton Pearson is emerging as a kind of godfather of soul, or rather souls, all souls. The philosophy he was now warming to was a social justice-based, ethics-based way of being in the world. And that made Carlton a pariah in his circles, but not everywhere. There was one group that liked and respected this moral pivot he'd made, and this group welcomed him with open arms, the Unitarians. And by the way, and this will give you an idea of how clueless I was about Unitarianism at the time. The church that approached him was All Souls Unitarian Church of Tulsa. And I looked back on my notes, and I saw I wrote it down as All Souls United Church, because the word Unitarian didn't register. I didn't know what it was. I assumed I must have misheard him, and he said United. Well, it turned out that Carlton didn't know much about the Unitarians either. He discovered, to his surprise, that these old hippies were fellow travelers in a lot of ways. They supported Cesar Chavez and the farm workers movement. They were anti-poverty activists. And they were, as he put it, almost totally inclusionary. A lot of their pastors were gay, he said. That was a little disconcerting to me at first, but I got past it. Actually, he got past it in a big hurry. He was soon advocating for gay rights, and he lobbied Congress to pass protections against hate crimes against gay women and men. And the theology of this new group of besties, his besties, it was right up his alley too, his new alley, radical acceptance and worthy acts. Carlton hadn't so much junked the idea of heaven and hell as he'd reframed it. Heaven and hell, these are places people occupy on this earth. Folks were saying, and this was not long after 9/11, remember, so Osama bin Laden was still on the loose, and folks were saying, surely Osama bin Laden is going to hell. And Carlton said, no, he's not going to hell. He's there now. He lives in a cave. He's being hunted like an animal. He is in hell. And they go, come on. There's got to be a place mass murderers go. And Carlton says, well, since we're talking mass murderers, what about the God of the Old Testament? At least the people bin Laden killed stopped hurting at some point. But the way the Bible tells it, the unsaved are writhing and weeping and wailing for eternity. Like my daddy used to say, you're going to be cooking, but you ain't never going to get done. The Unitarians said to Carlton, would you consider coming to speak in our pulpit? And he said, I will. So Carlton gets up there, and one of the first things he does is he basically apologizes to the congregation. He says, you know, I drove by this church many times, and each time I tried to cast the devil out of it, and I ended up getting cast into it. The people I denounced as cursed by God with AIDS, these same people washed my feet. And he went on, I used to have honor in this town, and now it looks like I still have honor, but it's not from the people whose honor I used to care about. It's from the people I never thought twice about. Some of the most reverent behavior I've ever seen has come from atheists and agnostics. I was in a pro-love march in Atlanta last weekend, he said, and I saw an atheist with a sign, God loves atheists. It was the highlight of my weekend. I asked him, if someone comes to you and says, Bishop Pearson, I'm losing my faith, what do you tell them? And this was his answer. He said, we spend our lives impersonating who we think others want us to be. And we lose ourselves and perhaps never find ourselves and end up living as imposters. So when someone comes to me and tells me they're losing their faith, I congratulate them. I say, you're starting to embrace your own thinking self, the essential, immutable, immortal self, as opposed to the accidental criminal you have been made to think you are. You are not deluded. You're actually becoming delivered from the mindset that crippled your nature with self-loathing. Bruce, he said, I had no idea how into self-loathing I was. God was difficult to please and almost impossible to appease. So I developed all these tricks to curry favor with this God who had this terrible anger management problem. I told my editor at the magazine, I know this isn't really what you assigned, but this, I feel pretty strongly, is where the piece wants to go. This is the most grown-up response to a spiritual emergency I think I've maybe ever seen. It's not a whipsaw overreaction, like I used to be all in with this faith, but now I know better and I'm throwing it all over the side. It's not a total reversal from faithful to faithless. It's more like taking a big step back in order to reappraise. And while you're out there, between unplugging yourself and plugging yourself back in again, you go deep into your own heart, into the silence there, so that you can finally hear the signal in the noise. I don't think I put it quite that way to the editor, but what I think I said was, can we please keep this guy in? And they let me keep him in. And I'm so glad they did. Carlton died in 2023, so that conversation becomes something I really cherish now. I've got to say, this is one of the more difficult reflections I've ever written, I think, because there are so many ways you can go with spiritual humility, and it's kind of untracked. There's a great term by Oliver Berkman, cosmic insignificance therapy, he called it, where you come to understand your smallness in the scheme of things. And I think that's a kind of spiritual humility. There's a mindset of casting your spiritual net very wide, and there's a lot of labels you can put on that. Aldous Huxley called it holy indifference. The Dharma teacher Mel Ash called it holy ambivalence. Barbara Brown Taylor, a professor of religion and philosophy, calls it holy envy. You sort of swoon over each new faith you investigate because there's almost invariably something to fall in love with there. Intellectual humility is my reference point now for kind of everything. It's the lens I see the world through, pretty much. So I figured that maybe that's what spiritual humility is. It's just intellectual humility in a cassock. But it's actually not. It's quite different. A central idea of intellectual humility is that we need to right-size our confidence level in our opinions, which means kind of calibrating our confidence according to our expertise in that area. So if I really don't know much about something, I should probably hold my opinions very lightly there. But if I'm an expert, I can afford to be a bit more firm, and I should be. It's like, as one of the psychologists, Daryl Van Tongeren, put it, you wouldn't want your brain surgeon to go, gee, I don't know, Daryl, what do you think we should do? Daryl's like, hey man, you are the one holding the scalpel. This is no time to be waffling. But with spiritual humility, there is no right sizing because there are no experts. In spiritual matters, nobody's an expert. So the right size of your confidence should be 0. That's why I think the agnostics are maybe on firmer footing than the atheists here. There's a really interesting cat, this guy named Greg Epstein, who said in an interview recently, we truly need more agnosticism in this world. And that's not something I ever thought I would say. So Epstein, this guy, is the humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT, both places. Humanist chaplain. Who knew there was such a thing? To most people, humanist means atheist, and that's how Greg Epstein self-identified too. For 20 years, he called himself an atheist. But he found himself less and less comfortable with that category because it kind of implied certainty. And he's going, what am I modeling here? He decided it's not only is it okay to admit we don't know everything, in some ways that's the more honorable stance, to go, hey, life's uncertain and we're doing our best to figure it out, and that's the whole deal. By being agnostic, what we're doing, he said, is cultivating an immune response within ourselves and our culture. And now, each shiny new thing coming at us, labeled the truth, hits our shields and gets scrutinized hard before we let it in. And when we do, if we do, that is a decision our whole body is involved in. Intellectual humility is an open mind. Spiritual humility is an open heart. Maybe it's as simple as that. There's a great line by Billy Connolly. Avoid people who say they know the answer. Keep the company of people who are trying to understand the question. It's a rare and wonderful group that sees the world that way. Again, at the risk of dragging my muffler a bit here, I feel like on good days, that's us. That's us. And it is a rare thing. Unitarians are outnumbered by the mainstream religions like 10,000 to 1. Now, why is that? I think it's because ours is a riskier stance. Moving from spiritual certainty to ambivalence, there's a huge existential cost to that. Daryl Van Tongeren, who I spoke of earlier, states it flatly. He said, religion ticks the same boxes as a humanist community: support, companionship, meaning, but it wins on death. It wins on death. It has that trump card. We don't. We're all swimming naked here, hoping the tide doesn't go out. And we're clinging to this kind of generous, practical befuddlement. Like, actually, nobody knows. So, maybe the best we can do is try to be kind. In our Deepening Connections workshop, which we started a couple of Wednesdays ago, we did an exercise called the belief spectrum. And the idea was to get a snapshot of the range of the beliefs in this group. So we asked people, imagine there's an invisible line on the floor, and it's a scale from strong belief to no belief. So at one end is there is no God, pretty darn sure of that. No God, no higher power, above us only sky. On the other end is I believe. Not sure what to call it, this powerful force I believe in, but I'm pretty convinced there is something rather than nothing. So we asked folks to place themselves along the line where they thought they would fit. And it was a beautifully even distribution. I found myself a little bit toward the theist end, the I believe there is something rather than nothing camp. And I remembered that the first time I did this exercise 15 years ago, I put myself in a different place. I was closer to the middle with the agnostics. Interesting. So then we did a kind of cruel thing to these lovely people. After explaining that it's a spectrum, very personal and fuzzy and open to interpretation, put yourself on the line right where it feels right to you, Rebecca and I cut the line in 3. And we made 3 groups, and we sent them each to a different corner of the room. The atheists, the agnostics, and the theists. Talk amongst yourselves, please. There's a separate set of questions for each group. And it's like, wait, what? Suddenly you find yourself in a different group from the person you were just standing right next to on the line. That doesn't seem fair. And full disclosure, that was a little bit the point of the exercise, or one of them. A sort of sneaky underlayer to the exercise, because that's kind of the way life works. It's often pretty random the way the pie gets sliced. You find yourself out there in the world encountering somebody who is other. They're not in your group. And you realize all the forces working to keep it that way. Them and their group, and you and yours. Different menus coming to your table, different news stories coming into your feed, a different package of values being promoted, a different narrative of what people like us believe. All these things working to drive you away from this person. And you look at them in the eye, and you know in your heart that this division between us is arbitrary. In actual fact, I am standing so close to you that I could reach across and take your hand. And you know what? I think I will. Thank you.
Sorry I
You are generous week in and week out. This community could not function without your gifts. Thank you so much. Thanks. I read a few announcements. It is sandwich day today. Diane Hicks has laid out a lovely spread downstairs, and there's an extra little surprise down there too, just to sweeten the pot, literally, for you. There's a congregational budget meeting after the service to discuss money matters, and please come to that if you're inclined. And Allison has asked me to, those who are signed up for the beginner singing lessons, she'd like to, and luckily we're in good time today, she'd like to begin it a little earlier than it was scheduled, so maybe 11:45 to 10 after. Is that about right?
We could probably, because the service is finishing a little earlier, we could probably even make it 20 to 12 to in there. So if you're one of the people who tends to stand up and you're scared of singing, no need. Dave, I'll meet you over there. That means cuddles. The building next door.
Cuddles.
Yeah,
Cuddles.
that way.
Cuddles. Does anyone else have any announcements that I haven't remembered to on the sheet? Film night.
I've got tickets for film night, the February 7th, 28th, and March the 7th.
Right, and can people still sign up? Plenty of room? Do we know what the?
I've got the tickets right here.
Do you know what the film? What's the first film?
We announced that in the e-bulletin on this Friday.
Oh, I see.
7 days prior.
I see. It's like in the old days where you just said, "You want to go to the movies?" Yeah, it didn't matter what was on. We're going to the movies. Okay. Oh, and Paul's got. You want to talk about your guitar?
Guitar interest group continues on Tuesday.
Guitar interest group. You don't have to play. You just have to like to hear a guitar being played. Okay, great. Well, that's it. I think that's it. Let's do our final congregational hymn, number 298. Wake now, my senses. Humility, friends. While working on this service, I came across a word I'd never heard before. Zimzum. It's a word coined by a 16th century Jewish mystic. It means withdrawal. And it was hatched in a biblical context. The idea was that before God could create the world, he had to first get out of that space, step back and make room for it, for everything, for us. I think of it as a kind of cosmic Robbie rule. The word has since crept into circulation in secular context. There's even a book called The Zimzum Marriage, which boils down to a pledge to seeing your partner whole against the sky, as good to put it. Zimzum means something like humility, I think. Pulling back your own ego to make space for others to grow. Getting it through our noggins that, hey, it's not all about me. It never was. It's about us. May we never forget it. Let's extinguish our flame. We extinguish this flame. The world calls us to live with depth, meaning, and purpose.
We go forth with courage and love.
Thank you to everyone who made this service possible. And there's some tough stuff coming, I think, and soon. And all we can do is hang together and try to live the right way. I so appreciate you coming, and have a great week. Let's circle around.